Please welcome filmmaker and director of Li, Ellen Kuras, and producer and star of Li, Kate Winslet. Here to lead the conversation is Atlantic staff writer Shirley Li.
I'll let you both soak that in for a minute. Ellen, thank you for being here. And Kate, thank you so much for zooming in. I hope you can maybe sort of see that the crowd was standing up for you. I know that we all just saw an extraordinary picture about an extraordinary woman. I mean, Lee Miller was extraordinary. She went from being a fashion model to being a war photographer. She went from hanging out with artists like Picasso to posing naked in Hitler's bathtub in an extraordinary photograph. So I want to start with Kate. Kate, I understand that you had been doing years of research on Lee before recruiting your super team of collaborators to bring this film to life. How did you first encounter Lee's work, and what about it made you want to commit her story to screen?
Can you hear me okay? Is that too loud and echoey?
No.
Probably is, isn't it?
This is great.
Thank you all so much for that phenomenal applause there. That I can't tell you how much it means to us all after so many years of dedication and doing everything we could to bring Lee's story, this decade of her life, to the screen, and just thank you for that. So I knew who Lee Miller was, and I was very familiar with her photographic work. But what I didn't know was who she was as a woman, her courage, what she represented to other women. I really didn't know anything about that part of her life. And I went and I was in a situation actually where some friends of mine work in an auction house, and they called me and they said, Kate, this incredible table has come into the auction house and we've done some research on it and you're just not going to believe the story. And they told me it was a table that was the kitchen table in a holiday home owned by the Penrose family. So Roland and his sister Annie and their cousins, they would share this home. At the time that Lee and Roland had just met and they were lovers, they were spending wonderful summers in this holiday home with the likes of Picasso and Max Ernst and Paul Eluard. And Lee would cook and she would prepare the food at this table, and they would sit at this table and they would eat and they would talk and they would chat into the late hours. And I'm sure many other things happened probably around and maybe even on that table actually. And I thought to myself, I've got to get this table, so I did. And it arrived in my home, and I put my hands on it, and I just thought, Lee Miller, why hasn't anyone made a film about her? And so the first thing I did, and that was 2015, I went and I met Anthony Penrose, because I knew that was the first and most important thing to do. And when I saw him, he opened out his arms like this, and he said, I have always hoped that if a film were to be made about my mother, that you would play her. And I couldn't believe it. And from that moment on, I just knew that I had no option but to do it and put my foot on the gas like Lee did and never take it off. And it was so important to me to lift her out of that male gaze. You know, when I Googled her, she was defined as the ex-lover, former muse of Man Ray, ex-covergirl, Vogue model, these sort of somewhat infantilizing labels that had been stuck on her. And I was worried that they would stay that way. And even though books had been written about her work as a war correspondent, there just wasn't enough that truly celebrated this decade of Lee's life when Lee became Li, when she started redefining femininity to mean resilience and power and courage and compassion. And I knew that it was important to make the film not just because we wanted to be authentic to her life, but in the spirit of who she was. So we led with compassion and power and resilience in making the film. And I can honestly tell you, 9 years later, I am so proud of what we have done. And it just means a lot to be finally talking about it, to be honest.
I mean, to Kate's point of redefining who Lee Miller was and her legacy, one of the biggest themes of this film is kind of the cost of female empowerment. She broke barriers in a male-dominated field to, and that also took a toll. But she is a pioneering woman in journalism and in photography. And Ellen, I want to ask you, how do you hope this film, speaks to contemporary audiences about issues of gender equality and women's agency?
Well, first I would say it's such an honor that Lee is here at this particular festival, being a photojournalist and being a war correspondent amongst many of the best journalists in the world. And, we realized, how important journalism is, and also Lee herself, was so dedicated to finding and telling the truth. And I think that's particularly pertinent now here, where we've been talking about art and politics. But Lee herself, she's a very contemporary woman. I mean, when we look at her in the film, we can identify with her. Not only if we are a woman or a man, we can identify with her emotional journey that she's going through and the cost that she paid to tell the story and to try and tell the story of what was happening during the war.
Yeah.
And also, I just want to say, the thing about today is that, Kate and I talked about setting the film in the late 30s. So, everybody in the film, when we come to them, they're just on the cusp of they don't know and they're unaware of what's about to happen. And I think that we are in a similar situation now where we're on the verge of political upheaval. And we also, a lot of people are unaware of what's about to happen. And I think that's something else that we can take from the film, having so many layers, but also it's a reminder of what was happening at the time and what they were then to experience later in the war.
I want to go back to Kate and ask a little bit more about the long journey that it took to bring this film to life. I read that you, as a producer, encountered some pushback from male executives about funding for the film, and at some point you had to pay for production salaries for 2 weeks yourself. So can you tell us about those roadblocks and how that affected your drive to get this made?
So in the process of coming to understand you and developing a script and working with Hannah and our team, our female writers on the piece, I just became more and more immersed in the world, full and complete access to the archive that Anthony Penrose the people of, and in there, not only is there her camera kit and Billy Sherman's camera kit, but there are all of her negatives and prints of everything she did during the war, and her clothes, and her personal letters between herself and Audrey, and Penrose, even personal diaries that are very small, and she talks a lot about her mental health as a teenager, actually. So I started to absorb who she was, and I felt there were many things that were parallels between myself and her. The determination to keep going, the things I learned as a younger actress, having to hold my own in male-dominated spaces when, even as little as 50 years ago, it wasn't quite the way it is now, in the sense that women were only having a voice to be able to say, hold on, don't you say that to me. Not so much that, but now we are in a time where the culture has shifted so much that we crave women's stories more than ever, but also our ears are open in a way that they never really have been before. And so I knew that this film would be timely because of those things, and because we need to celebrate women of history who were pioneers in their field. I mean, when you look at the work that Li did with that female gaze, you know, the use of the Rolleiflex, which I'm proud to say I got quite good at, and I was really taking photographs of everything as we were shooting. Can you guys still hear me? Yes, you can?
We can.
Okay, just checking. The Rolleiflex camera, you know, it sits somewhere between the heart and the stomach. And what that enabled Li to do was to look down at the image, but then straight into the eyes and into the soul of the person or people she was photographing. Therefore, meeting them at whatever place they were at, really stepping in, showing up, being present, bearing witness, and never, ever looking away. And were it not for her, I just think, my God, would we ever really have known those stories of those people in the way that she told them, honoring their truth, revealing the atrocities of the Nazi regime with a woman's eye? For me, this was just so tremendously powerful. And when I think today about the war correspondents who are women, so many of whom I spoke to in the preparation for this film, when I think about the courage that they have to have now in the way the world is and how much it has advanced, I just bow down to them. I mean, Li not only earned her place at the table, but she was determined to sit at the goddamn head of that table. And it makes me feel so proud to have played her. So much of her has stayed in me. And the process of putting the film together was lengthy, but, you know, when we talk about this 9 years that have now gone by, none of it was me feeling impatient. None of it was me trying to hurry up. It was me trying to really get it right, make it with the right people, because it required that. It needed that level of care. And so, yes, it's absolutely true that we sat with a male investor and he said, why should I like this woman? And I won't say the things that I wanted to say that were bubbling up inside of me. And I just thought, well, we just won't be making the film with you then. And then there was another man, a director, who was trying to convince me to do a film with him, which I was very unsure about. And at one point, I was on a Zoom call with him, and he said, "Oh, you got a film about Li Miller, haven't you?" And I said, "Yeah." He said, "Where are you at with that?" And I said, "Well, you know, we're just starting now to put the financing together." He went, "Oh, listen, if you come and do my film, I'll help you get your little Li Miller film made."
Your little Li Miller film, huh?
I know. And so now I feel quite smug, and I feel so overwhelmed with pride that this was a group of women coming together. Myself and Ellen, Kate Solomon, my producing partner, who really, really pushed this thing over the line. And our department heads, great, extraordinary women who have been in the film world for decades. And to collaborate with all of them in the way that we did so closely and intricately it has been just the most special experience, an empowering experience of my life, really, truly.
On that note, I mean, we have Ellen here, and Ellen, I wanted to zoom in a little bit on the specifics of what you do in this film. I've read that you've called this film not a biopic, and that you wanted to film this through the female lens, speaking of cameras and lenses. But given your, renowned career as a cinematographer, what was your vision when it came to the visual grammar of making this film and ensuring that there was a balance between understanding Li's colorful backstory and her reality?
Well, in looking at the visuals, Kate and I had talked about that we didn't want to objectify her because she had been objectified for so long, as a model, early photography by her father. And she herself decided that she was going to not be in front of the camera anymore. She was going to take control and move behind the camera. So we wanted to honor that, and we wanted to not be watching her go through the motions of this film and of her life, we wanted to be with her as she went through the emotional journey. So part of that is not only the camera, but was also with sound. So we knew that we wanted to bring the camera closer to her so that we could hear her breathing, hear her heartbeat. And we set that up in the very, very beginning, where we take the sounds of the explosions and background them and bring her heart closer to us, which immediately helps us to understand that we're with her through this journey. And Pavel Edelman, who is the DOP, and myself and Kate, we had talked a lot about, where the camera could go so that we would feel with her, and we're going with her on the journey through that. And in terms of the color, we knew that we wanted to use the production design, the wardrobe with Michael O'Connor, production design with Gemma Jackson, to create this world in the south of France when life was carefree and they weren't thinking about what was to come. To have bright color and bright light and a vibrance to it with the camera. And then to gradually move darker and darker into the heart of darkness, literally, so it almost becomes black and white. And so, we wanted to do that gradually so that it would just come and be part of the subconscious subtext of the film, so you just feel it instead of noticing it.
Speaking of the way that time passes in this film, Kate, back to you. You portray her at all these different stages of life, when she's happily ensconced with her artist friends afar from the war, when she's in the thick of it, photographing the aftermath of violence, when she's an old woman, quote unquote, almost tired of talking about the past. Which stage did you find the most exciting to play? And on the flip side, which was perhaps the most daunting for you to access?
God, it's such a big question. I'm not going to lie. It was all amazing, but it was all incredibly tough. And in those moments when we would think, okay, we've got something big to do today, whether it be Dachau or Hitler's bathtub scene, we at all times were guided by Li's images. And that was built into the script. And it was our job to make sure that we were honoring what she saw and her experience, building that narrative, inventing that narrative around how she came to be there, the courage she had to climb up. I mean, you can't even contemplate it, to climb up and into that carriage and stand amongst the corpses and photograph the faces of the naive soldiers staring in. I mean, the mind just boggles. So there were moments like that that were phenomenally hard. Of course, Dachau was very difficult for all of us, really awful for all of us. But quite honestly, for me, the hardest part was the PTSD, because everything about how I was trying to play her was all about keeping a lid on the stuff that was way down deep, buried deeply from her childhood. Li had refused to be defined by what had happened to her when she was 7 years old. And actually, it was remarkable how she didn't hate men. She was without malice. She totally lacked vengeance. And she treated everyone equally and was an incredibly compassionate person. But through what she witnessed during the war, she completely unraveled. And of course, all of that she had gone through as a child came back, and she couldn't stop feeling it and she couldn't stop seeing it. And so the scene when she goes into Vogue and she starts cutting into the Dachau negatives, Andrea Riseborough and I, at the end of that day, and we shot that scene and the scene immediately following when she reveals to Audrey what happened to her as they're sitting on the stairs. Those scenes landed in the one day, back to back. And Andrea and I, at the end of that day, we both said that was absolutely the hardest day of acting we've ever done, ever. And I think it was because both of those things happened. Li did go into Vogue, and she did look for her negatives, and she did start hacking into them as though she was almost trying to cut them out of herself. And I know that because one of the people I met in the research was a woman who's now very elderly, but she was a 15-year-old girl working as a secretary for Vogue. And Lee came in and she said to me, Kate, I will tell you, she was actually rather drunk. And it was the middle of the day and she just was in a frenzy and she was ripping open drawers and pulling lids off boxes and going through the filing cabinets until she found what she was looking for, and she attacked them. And this woman said that she thought Lee was going to injure herself. So aggressive was this frenzy. And she stopped her by telling her, those are my good scissors. Now you give them back, Lee Miller. And Lee did put them down and she walked out. And we always knew that it was going to have to be a scene in the film because, of course, that metaphor of her trying to cut something out of herself. But then that combined immediately with the scene that follows it. Lee never told anyone what happened to her. And the only reason that her son, Anthony Penrose, knows is that when he was writing Lives of Lee Miller after his mother had died, there was something he felt he couldn't put his finger on about her. And he said, I can't explain it. It was just like something was not quite right. There was something I couldn't quite get. And so he went and he sat with his uncles, Eric and John, Lee's brothers. And he said, is there anything else? I'm almost at the end of this. Is there anything left? And they said, actually, forgive me. And they sat him down and they told him. And they were also told to never tell. And the night before we shot that scene, which had gone through many different drafts, as you would imagine, with any screenplay, and it was well written and it landed and it was good. It was watertight. But I always knew that I somehow had to not look at that scene anymore, because the night before I knew I was going to phone Tony, and I knew that we were going to just talk through it again and possibly even find a version of it that felt more present. And so I did. I called Tony the night before and he said, it's tomorrow, isn't it? And I said, yes, it is. And he said, are you all right? And I said, well, I think I'll be all right once we've done it. I said, but for now, let's just go through it. Just tell me again. Tell me what they said and where and who, and let's go through it. And we wrote it together. And I just had it in pencil on a piece of paper. And I quickly learned it. And the next day went into work. And I said to Ellen and Kate, Tony and I rewrote this scene last night. And they said, oh, okay, we'll get it printed up and, we'll share it with everyone. I said, actually, do you mind if I just do it? Because I knew that the only way I was going to get anywhere close to embodying what Lee had gone through and being true to her was if it felt like it was just falling out of me.
Kate, thank you for sharing that. I do want to, this is an affecting film to watch. It's certainly an affecting film to have worked on. And as we wrap up, Ellen, just a final question for you. As someone who has worked as a filmmaker across genres, across all genres, including making a documentary, The Betrayal, that was Oscar nominated, I wonder what you have taken away from working on a film that is very much speaking to the broader question of the role that artists play in documenting and interpreting history. What's been your takeaway as someone who works with images?
Well, I think when I see the film again, I am very much reminded of how important it is, to find the truth in stories. And also, besides knowing Lee Miller's life and getting to, follow her emotional journey with her, but to know and feel, her commitment to finding justice and for, trying to get the story out. And we see the price that she paid, that the story wasn't published. And, she was a witness, but it wasn't seen. And I think, particularly today where we see journalists being killed and photojournalists being killed, and what's going to happen if there's no witnesses. And Lee was so determined to find out what happened to those people who were missing. She needed to get that story. And I think that that's a kind of determination, that carries us through and also, enables us to carry on her legacy.
It's a story of resilience and of courage, and it's beautifully put together and beautifully performed. And on that note, I'm afraid we don't have any more time, but thank you
Kate.
both so much
Thank you, Kate.
for being here. Lee is in theaters starting September 27th. Thank you all for being at the Atlantic Festival.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Kate. Kate.